AD 1049. This year the emperor gathered an innumerable army against Baldwin of Bruges, because he had destroyed the palace of Nimeguen, and because many other ungracious acts that he did against them. The army was immense that he had collected together. There was Leo, the Pope of Rome, and the Patriarch, and many other great men of several provinces. He sent also King Edward, and requested of him naval aid, that he might not permit him to escape from him by water. Whereupon he went up to Sandwich, and there lay a large naval armament, until the emperor had all that he wished of Baldwin. Thither also came back again Earl Swain, who had gone from his land in Denmark, and there ruined his cause with the Danes. He came hither with a pretence, saying that he would again submit to the king and be his man, and he requested Earl Bourne to be assistants of him, and with him give land to feed him upon. But Harold, his brother, and Earl Bourne resisted him, and would give him nothing of that which the king had given them. The king also refused him everything, whereupon Swain retired to his ships at Bosham. Then, after the settlement between the emperor and Baldwin, many ships went home, and the king remained behind Sandwich with a few ships. Earl Godwin also sailed 42 ships from Sandwich to Pevensey, and Earl Bourne went with him. Then the king gave leave to all the Mercians to return home, and they did so. Then it was told to the king that Osgood lay at Ulps with 39 ships, whereupon the king sent after the ships that he might dispatch, which before had gone homewards, but they still lay at the Nore. And then Osgood fetched his wife from Bruges, and they went back again with 6 ships, but the rest went towards Essex to Adolfsness, and there plundered, and then returned to their ships. But there came upon them a strong wind, so that they were all lost but 4 persons, who were afterwards slain beyond sea. Whilst Earl Godwin and Earl Bourne lay at Pevensey with their ships, came Earl Swain, and with a pretence requested of Earl Bourne, that was his uncle's son, that he would be his companion to the king at Sandwich, and better his condition with him, adding that he would swear oaths to him and be faithful. Whereupon Bourne concluded that he would not for their relationship betray him. He therefore took 3 companions with him, and they rode to Bosham, where his ships lay, as though they should proceed to Sandwich. But they suddenly bound him, and led him to the ships, and went thence with him to Dartmouth, where they ordered him to be slain and buried deep. He was afterwards found, and Harold, his cousin, fetched him thence, and led him to Winchester, to the old minster, where they buried him with King Canute his uncle. Then the king and all the army proclaimed Swain an outlaw. A little before the men of Hastings, and thereabout fought with their 2 ships, and slew all the men, and brought the ships to Sandwich to the king. 8 ships had he, ere he betrayed Bourne. Afterwards they forsook him except 2, whereupon he went eastward to the land of Baldwin, and sat there all winter at Bruges, in full security. In the same year came up from Ireland 36 ships on the Welsh coast, and thereabout committed outrages with the aid of Griffin, the Welsh king. The people were soon gathered against them, and there was also with them Bishop Ealdred. But they had too little assistance, and the enemy came unawares on them very early in the morning, and slew on the spot many good men. But the others burst forth with the bishop. This was done on the 4th day before the calends of August. This year died the good Bishop Eadnoth in Oxfordshire, and Oswy, Abbot of Dormy, and Wulfnoth, Abbot of Westminster, and King Edward gave the bishopric which Eadnoth had to Ulf his priest, but it ill betided them, and he was driven from it, because he did not like a bishop therein, so that it shameth us now to say more. Bishop Siward also died, who lies at Abingdon. In this same year King Edward put 9 ships out of pay, and the crews departed, and went away with the ships withal, leaving 5 ships only behind, for whom the king ordered 12 months' pay. The same year went Bishops Herman and Aldred to the Pope at Rome on the king's errand. This year was also consecrated the great minsters at Reims, in which the presence of Pope Leo and the Emperor. There was also a great synod at Saint Remy, at which was present Pope Leo, with the archbishops of Burgundy, of Bescanon, of Trèves and Rheims, and many wise men besides, both clergy and laity. A great synod there held they respecting the service of God, at the instance of St. Leo the Pope. It is difficult to recognize all the bishops that came there thither, and also abbots. King Edward sent thither Bishop Dudok and Bishop Wulfric of St. Augustine's and Elphin Abbot of Ramsey, with the intent that they should report to the king what was determined there concerning Christendom. This same year came Earl Swain into England. A.D. 1050. This year returned the bishops home from Rome, and Earl Swain had his sentence of outlawry reversed. The same year died Edsy, Archbishop of Canterbury, on the 4th day before the calends of November, and also in the same year Elfric, Bishop of York, on the 11th calendar day before February. A very venerable man and wise, and his body lies at Peterborough. Then had King Edward a meeting of the Great Council in London, in mid-Lent, which he appointed Robert the Frank, who was Bishop of London, Archbishop of Canterbury now, and he during the same Lent went to Rome after his poll. The king, meanwhile, gave the see of London to Sparrock, Abbot of Abingdon, but it was taken from him again before he was consecrated. The king also gave the abbacy of Abingdon to Bishop Rodulf, his cousin. The same year he put all the lightermen out of pay. The Pope held a council again at Vercelli, and Bishop Ulf came thither, where he nearly had his staff broken. He had not paid more money, because he could not perform his duties so well as he should. The same year King Edward abolished the Danegeld, which King Ethelred imposed. This was in the 39th year after it had begun. That tribute harassed all the people of England so long as is above written, and it was always paid before other imposts, which were levied indiscriminately and vexed men variously. A.D. 1051. This year came Archbishop Robert hither over the sea with his pall from Rome, one day before St. Peter's Eve, and he took the archiepiscopal seat at Christchurch on St. Peter's Day, and soon after this went to the king. Then came Abbot Sparhawk to him with the king's written seal, to the intent that he should consecrate him Bishop of London, but the archbishop refused, saying that the Pope had forbidden him. Then went the abbot to the archbishop again for the same purpose, and they demanded episcopal consecration, but the archbishop obstinately refused. Then went the abbot to London, and sat the archbishopric, which the king had given before him with his full leave all the summer and autumn. Then during the same year came Eustace, who had the sister of King Edward to wife, from beyond sea, soon after the bishop, and went to the king, and having spoken with him whatever he chose, he then went homeward. When he came to Canterbury eastward, there he took a repast, and his men, whence he proceeded to Dover. When he was about a mile or more on this side of Dover, he put on his breastplate, and so did all his companions, and they proceeded to Dover. When they came thither, they resolved to quarter themselves wherever they lived. Then came one of his men, and would lodge at the house of a master family against his will, but having wounded the master of the house, he was slain by the other. Then Eustace, quickly upon his horse, and his companions upon theirs, having gone to the master of the family, slew him on his own hearth. Then, going to the boroward, they slew both within and without more than 20 men. The townsmen slew 19 men on the other side and wounded more, but they knew not how many. Eustace escaped with a few, and went again to tell the king, telling him partially how they fared, and the king was very wroth with the townsmen, and sent off Earl Godwin, bidding him go into Kent with hostility to Dover. For Eustace had told the king that the guilt of the townsmen was greater than his, but it was not so, and the earl would not consent to the expedition, because he was loth to destroy his own people. Then sent the king after all his council, and bade them come to Gloucester, nigh after the Mass of St. Mary. Meanwhile Godwin took it much to heart that in his earldom that such a thing should happen, whereupon he begged to gather forces over his earldom, and Earl Swain his son over his, and Harold his other son over his earldom, and thus they assembled at Gloucestershire, at Langtree, a large tree, an innumerable army, all ready for battle against the king, unless Eustace and his men were delivered to them handcuffed, and also that the Frenchmen that were in the castle were done the same. This was done 7 nights before the latter Mass of St. Mary, where King Edward was sitting in Gloucester. Whereupon he sent after Earl Llywelyn, and the north after Earl Siward, and summoned their retinues. At first they came to him with moderate aid, but when they found out how it was in the south, they sent the north all over their earldom, and ordered a large force to help their lord. So did Ralph also over his earldom, and then they came to Gloucester to aid the king, though it was late. So unanimous were they in all defence of the king, that they would seek Godwin's army if they desired it. But some prevented that, because it was very unwise that they should come together. For in 2 armies there were almost all that was the noblest in England. They therefore prevented this, that they themselves might not leave the land of the mercy of their foes, whilst engaged in destructive conflict betwixt ourselves. Then it was advised that they should exchange hostages with them, and they issued proclamations throughout London, whither all the people was summoned, over all this north end in Siward's earldom, and Llywelyn's, and also elsewhere, and Earl Godwin was to come thither with his sons to a conference. They came as far as Southwark, and very many of them from Wessex, but his army continually diminished more and more, for they bound over to the king all the thanes that belonged to Earl Harold and his son, and outlawed Earl Swain his other son. When it could not serve the purpose, come to a conference against the king and many of that army that were with him, he went in the night away. In the morning the king held a council, and proclaimed him an outlaw, with his whole army, himself and his wife, and all his 3 sons, Swain, Tostig, and Griffith. And he went south to Thorney with his wife, and Swain his son, and Tostig and his wife, and a cousin of Baldwin of Bruges, and his son Griff. Earl Harold with Llywelyn went to Bristol in the ship that Earl Swain had before prepared and provisioned for himself. And the king sent Bishop Aldred from London with his retinue, with orders to overtake him ere he came to the ship. But they either could not or would not, and he then went out from the mouth of the Avon. But he encountered such adverse weather that he got off with difficulty and suffered great loss. He then went forth to Ireland, as soon as the weather had permitted. In the meantime, the Welshmen had wrought a castle in Herefordshire, in the territory of Earl Swain, and brought as much injury and disgrace on the king's men thereabout as they could. Then came Earl Godwin, and Earl Swain, and Earl Harold together at Beverston, and many men with them, intent that they might go to their natural lord and to all the peers assembled with him, to the king's counsel and assistance, and that of all the peers together, how they might avenge the insult that was offered to the king and to all of the nation. But the Welshmen were before with the king, and bewrayed their earls, so that they were not permitted to come within the sight of his eyes, for they declared that they intended to come thither to betray the king. There was now assembled before the king Earl Siward, Llywelyn, and many people from the north, and it was told Earl Godwin and his sons that the king and his men who were with him would take counsel against them. But they prepared themselves firmly to resist, though they were loth to proceed against their natural lord. Then advised the peers on either side that they should abstain from all hostility, and the king gave God's peace and his friendship to each party. Then advised the king and his council that there should be a second time a general assembly of all the nobles in London at the autumn equinox, and the king ordered out an army both south and north of the Thames, the best that ever was. Then was Earl Swain proclaimed an outlaw, and Earl Godwin and Earl Harold were summoned to the council as early as they could come. When they came thither, and were cited to the council, then required they security and hostages, that they might come into the council and go without treachery. It was from Thorney that Godwin and those were with him sent to Bruges, to Baldwin's land, in one ship, with as much treasure as they could lodge therein from each man. Wonderful would it have been, thought by every single man there that was in England, if any person had said before that it would end thus. For he was before raised such a height that he ruled the king and all England. His sons were earls and the king's darlings, and his daughter wedded and united to the king. Soon after this took place, the king dismissed the lady who had been consecrated his queen, and ordered all to be taken from her that she had in land, all gold, silver, and all things. Soon after came Earl William from beyond the sea with a large retinue of Frenchmen, and the king entertained him, as many of his companions as were convenient to him, and let him depart again. Then was Abbot Spark driven from his bishopric in London, and William the king's priest was invested therewith. Then was Odie appointed Earl over Devonshire, and over Somerset, and over Dorset and Wales, and Elgar the son of Llywelyn was promoted to the earldom which Harold before had possessed. A.D. 1052. This year died Elfgive, the lady relict of King Ethelred and of King Canute, on the 2nd before the nones of March. In the same year Griffin the Welsh king plundered Herefordshire, until he came very nigh to Leominster, and they gathered against him, and very great slaughter was made of many English and also many French. That was on the same day which 13 years before Eadwine had been slain by his companions. A.D. 1053. About this time was the great wind on the Mass night of St. Thomas, which did much harm everywhere, and all the midwinter was also much wind. It was this year that resolved to slay Rhys, the Welsh king's brother, because he did harm, and they brought his head to Gloucester on the eve of Twelfth Day. In this same year, before Alamholimus, died Wulfsy, Bishop of Lichfield, and Godwin, Abbot of Winchcombe, and Aylward, Abbot of Glastonbury, all within 1 month. And Llywelyn, Abbot of Coventry, took to the bishopric of Lichfield, Bishop Aldred to the abbacy of Winchcombe, and Aylnoth took the abbacy of Glastonbury. The same year died Elfric, brother of Oda, at Deerhurst, and his body resteth Peershaw. In this year was the last King of Winchester at Easter, and Earl Godwin with him, and Earl Harrod his son, and Tostig. On the day after Easter sat he with the king at the table, and he suddenly sunk beneath against all the foot-rail, deprived of speech and all his strength. He was brought into the king's chamber, and they supposed that it would pass over. But it was not so. He continued thus speechless and helpless there till Thursday, where he resigned his life. On the 17th, before the calends of May, he was buried at Winchester in the Old Minster. Earl Harold, his son, took to the earldom that his father had before, and to all that his father possessed, while Earl Elgar took to the earldom that Harold had before. The Welshmen this year slew a great many of the warders of the English people at Westbury. This year there was no archbishop in the land, but Bishop Staytand held the see of Canterbury at Christchurch, and Kinsey that of York. Llywelyn and Wulfwy went over the sea, and had themselves consecrated as bishops there. Wulfwy took to the bishopric which Ulf had whilst he was living in exile. A.D. 1054. This year died Leo, the holy pope at Rome, and Victor was chosen pope in his stead. And in this year was so great the loss of cattle, as was not remembered for many winters before. This year went Earl Siward with a large army against Scotland, consisting both of marines and land forces, and engaging with the Scots, he put to flight the King Macbeth, and slew all the best in the land, and led thence much spoil, so as no man had before obtained. And he fell also on his side both Danish and English, even his own son Osborne, and his sister's son Siward, and many of his housecarls, and also many of the kings were slain that day, which were that of 7 sleepers. This same year went Bishop Aldred south over sea into Saxony to Cologne on the king's errand, where he was entertained with great respect by the emperor, abode there well nigh a year, and received presents not only from the court, but from the Bishop of Cologne and the emperor. He commissioned Bishop Llywelyn to consecrate the minster at Evesham, and it was consecrated in the same year on the 6th before the Ides of October. This year also died Osgood Clapper, suddenly in his bed, as he lay at rest. A.D. 1055. This year died Earl Siward at York, and his body lies within the minster at Galmano, which he had himself ordered to be built and consecrated in the name of God and Saint Olav, to the honour of God and to all of his saints. Archbishop Kinsey fetched his pall from Pope Victor. Then, within a little time after, a general council was summoned to London 7 nights before mid-Lent, at which Earl Elgar, son of Earl Leofric, was outlawed, almost without any guilt, because it was said against him that he was the betrayer of the king and of all people of the land. and he was arraigned thereof before all that were assembled, though the crime laid to his charge was unintentional. The king, however, gave the earldom which Earl Siward formerly had to Tostig, son of Earl Godwin, whereupon Earl Elgar sought Griffin's territory in North Wales. Thence he went to Ireland, and there gave him a fleet of 18 ships besides his own, and then returned to Wales to King Griffin with the armament, who received him on terms of amity. And they gathered a great force with the Irish and the Welsh, and Earl Ralph collected a great army against them at the town of Hereford, where they met, but ere there was a spear thrown, the English people fled, because they were upon horses. The enemy then made a great slaughter there, about 400 or 500 men, they on the other side, none. And then they went to the town, and burned it utterly, and a large minster, of which the worthy Bishop Athelstan had caused to be built, they had plundered and bereft of relic and reef, and all of things whatsoever, and all the people they slew, and led some away. Then an army from all parts of England was gathered nigh, and they came to Gloucester, whence they sallied not far out against the Welsh, and there lay some time. Earl Harold caused the canal to be dug about the town all the while. Meantime, men began to speak of peace, and Earl Harold and those who had come with him to Bilsey, where amity and friendship were established between them. The sentence of outlawry against Earl Elgar was reversed, and they gave him all that was taken from him before. The fleet returned to Chester, and there they waited for pay, which Elgar had promised them. The slaughter was on the 9th before the calends of November. In the same year died Tremerig, the Welsh bishop, soon after the plundering, who was Bishop Athelstan's substitute after he had become infirm. AD 1056. This year Bishop Egelric resigned his bishopric at Durham and retired to Peterborough Minster, and his brother Egelwine succeeded him. The worthy Bishop Athelstan died on the 4th before the Ides of February, and his body lies at Hereford. To him succeeded Llywelyn, who was Earl Harold's mass priest. He wore his knapsack in his priesthood until he was a bishop. He abandoned his chrism and his rood, his ghostly weapons, and took to his spear and to his sword after his bishophood, and so marched to the field against Griffin the Welsh king. But he was there slain, and his priests with him, and Elnoth the sheriff, and many of the good men with them. The rest fled. This was 8 nights before midsummer. Difficult is it to relate the vexation on the journeying, the marching, and the fatigue, the fall of men and of horses, also which of the whole army of the English suffered, until Earl Leofric and Earl Harold and Bishop Eldred came together and made peace between them. So Griffin swore oaths that he would be a firm and faithful viceroy to King Edward. Then Bishop Eldred took to the bishopric which Llywelyn had before 11 weeks and 4 days. The same year died Cona, the emperor, and Earl Oda, whose body lies at Pershore, and was admitted a monk before his end, which was on the 2nd before the calends of September. A good man, and virtuous, truly noble. AD 1057. This year came Edward Atheling, the son of King Edmund, to this land, and soon after died. His body is buried within St. Paul's Minster in London. He was brothers to the son of King Edward. King Edmund was called Ironside for his valour. This Etheling King Canute had sent into Hungary to betray him. But he there grew in favour with good men, as God granted him, and it well became him, so that he obtained the emperor's cousin in marriage, and by her had fair offspring. Her name was Agatha. We know not for what reason it was done, that he should see his relation King Edward. Alas, that was a rueful time, and injurious to all this nation, that he ended his life soon after he came to England, to the misfortune of this miserable people. The same year died Earl Leofric, on the 2nd before the calends of October, who was very wise before God, and also before the world, and who benefited all this nation. He lies at Coventry, and his son Elgar took to his territory. This year died Earl Ralph, on the 12th before the calends of January, and lies at Peterborough. Also died Bishop Hecker in Sussex, and Egelric was elevated to his see. This year also died Pope Victor, and Stephen was chosen Pope, who was Abbot of Monnet Casino. AD 1058. This year was Earl Elgar banished, but he soon came in again by force, through Griffin's assistance, and a naval armament came from Norway. It is tedious to tell how it all fell out. In the same year, Bishop Aldred consecrated the Minster Church at Gloucester, which he himself had raised, to the honour of God and St. Peter, and then went to Jerusalem with such dignity as no other man did before him, and he betook himself there to God. A worthy gift he also offered to our Lord's sepulchre, which was a golden chalice of the value of 5 marks, of very wonderful workmanship. In the same year died Pope Stephen, and Benedict was appointed Pope. He sent hither the pall to Bishop Stigand, who was Archbishop consecrated Egelric a monk at Christchurch, Bishop of Sussex, and Abbot Siward, Bishop of Rochester. AD 1059. This year was Nicholas chosen Pope, who had been Bishop of Florence, and Benedict was expelled, who was Pope before. This year was also consecrated the steeple at Peterborough, on the 16th before the calends of November. AD 1060. This year was a great earthquake on the translation of St. Martin, and King Henry died in France. Kinsey, Archbishop of York, died on the 11th day before the calends of January, and he lies at Peterborough. Bishop Aldred succeeded to the see, and Walter to that of Hertfordshire. Dudok also died, who was Bishop of Somersetshire, and Gisa, the priest, was appointed in his stead. AD 1061. This year went Bishop Aldred to Rome after his pall, which he received at the hands of Pope Nicholas. Earl Tostig and his wife also went to Rome, and the bishop and the earl met with great difficulty as they returned home. In the same year died Bishop Godwin at St. Martin's, on the 7th before the Ides of March, and in the self-same year died Wulfric, Abbot of St. Augustine's, in the Easter week, on the 14th between the calends of May. Pope Nicholas also died, and Alexander was chosen Pope, who was Bishop of Lucca. When a word came to the king that the Abbot Wulfric was dead, then chose he Aethelsi, a monk of the Old Minster, to succeed, who followed Archbishop Stigand, and was consecrated Abbot at Windsor on St. Augustine's Mass Day. AD 1063. This year went Earl Harold, after midwinter from Gloucester to Rhuddlan, which belonged to Griffin, and that habitation be burned with his ships and all the rigging belonging thereto, and put him to flight. Then in gang days went Harold with his ships from Bristol about Wales, where he made a truce with the people, and they gave him hostages. Tostig meanwhile advanced with a land force against them and plundered the land, but in the harvest of the same year was King Griffin slain on the nones of August by his own men, through the war that he waged with Earl Harold. He was king over all the Welsh nation, and his head was brought to Earl Harold, who sent it to the king with the ship's head and the rigging therewith. King Edward committed the land to his two brothers, Blethgent and Rhygwartel, who swore oaths and gave hostages to the king and the earl, that they would be faithful to him in all things, ready to aid him everywhere, by water and by land, and would pay him such tribute from the land as was paid long before to other kings. A.D. 1065. This year, before Lammas, ordered Earl Harold and his men to build at Portskeworth in Wales. But when he had begun and collected many materials, and thought to have King Edward there for the purpose of hunting, even when it was all ready, came Caradoc, son of Griffin, with all the gang that he could get, and slew almost all that were building there, and they seized the materials that were there gotten ready. Wist we not know who first advised the wicked deed? This was done on the Mass Day of St. Bartholomew. Soon after this, all the thanes in Yorkshire and Northumberland gathered themselves together at York, and outlawed their Earl Tostig, slaying all the men of his clan that they could reach, both Danish and English, and took all his weapons in York with gold and silver, and all his money that they could anywhere find. Then they sent after Morcar, son of Earl Elgar, and chose him for their earl. He went south with all the shire, and with Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire and Lincolnshire, till he came to Northampton, where his brother Edwin came to meet him with the men that were in his earldom. Many Britons also came with him. Harold also met them, on whom they imposed an errand to King Edward, sending also messengers with him, and requesting that they might have Morcar for their earl. This the king granted, and sent back Harold to them on the eve of St. Simon and St. Jude, and announced them the same, and confirmed it by hand, renewing there the laws of Canute. But the Northmen did much harm about Northampton, whilst he was on their errand, either that they slew men, and burned houses and corn, or took all the cattle that they could come at, which amounted to many thousands. Many hundred men also they took, and led northward with them, so that only that shire, but others near it, were worse for many winters. And then Earl Tostig and his wife, and all who acted with him, went over the South Sea with him to Earl Baldwin, who received them all, and they were there for the winter. About midwinter came King Edward to Westminster, and had the minsters there consecrated, which he himself built to the honour of God and St. Peter and all of God's saints. This church hallowing was on Childermas Day, but he died on the eve of the 12th day, and was buried on the 12th day in the same minster, it is hereafter said. Here Edward King of Angle's Lord sent his steadfast soul to Christ, in the kingdom of God, a Holy Spirit, He in the world here abode, while in the nightly throng of council's sage, 24 winters wielding the sceptre freely, wealth he dispensed. In the tide of health, the youthful monarch, offspring of Ethelred, ruled well his subjects, the Welsh, and the Scots, and the Britons also, Angles and Saxons, relations of old. So apprehended the first rank, that to Edward all the noble king were firmly held high-seated men. Blithe-minded aye was the harmless king, though he long ere of land bereft, abode in exile wide on the earth, when Canute overcame the kin of Ethelred, and the Danes wielded the dear kingdom of England. 28 winters rounds they wealth dispensed. Then came forth, free in his chambers, the royal array, good, pure, and mild, Edward the noble, by his country defended, by land and people, until suddenly came the bitter death, and this king so dear snatched from our earth. Angles carried his soul so sincere into the light of heaven, but the prudent king had settled the realm on high-born men, on Harold himself, the noble earl, who in every season faithfully heard and obeyed his lord in word and deed, nor gave to any what might be wanted by the nation's king. This year also was the Earl Harold hallowed to king, but he enjoyed little tranquillity therein, the while that he wielded the kingdom. And there we have it, another part of the Chronicle that we close the pages upon for the moment, and we take a little break from it. Well, you know I'll be back tomorrow with a different kind of video. But I want to thank my top tier patrons and supporters: Dark, Gary, Kimberly, Ember, Ben, Britt, Charles, Aaron, James, Jeffrey, Melissa, Scott, Stark Factory, Wendy, Jaden, Sherry, Jessica, Christine, Sally, Katiana, Christine, Fazabo, Legitmus, Maverick, Susan, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Cameron, Alexander, Nicholas, Daniel, JR, Charlene, Christopher, and Lynn. Thank you all so much. And I'll see you, whether you join me in the next Anglo-Saxon Chronicle part, or if you'd like to check out one of my other videos. Either way, I wish you all the best. I thank you for watching, and as always, lots of love to all of you. Good night.